Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Thucydides Peloponnesian War. Today we are concluding the, the last bit of last chapters of chapter book 8, where we end where Thucydides' own account. Last time we finished. Last time we this last session we had first part of the 21st summer. Now, Thucydides ends his account. He has no more account after this summer. Okay, this summer, 21st summer of the war, which and now he died. Now the question: does he die? Does he not finish it? What? We know he dies. We know in that sense. We don't know what the circumstances of how what happened. Why didn't he finish this? Did his health get bad or something? And did his we don't really know that much about the circumstances of why this didn't. We just know he never really finished. Now we know he outlived the war because we know he wrote it after the war, and he wrote it, and we know that he talks about events that happened all through the book. That indicates that he's writing this whole project after seeing the war in that sense. To get the conclusion of the war, one really needs to turn to Xenophon's Hellenica. So I'm not going to do that, because it's beyond the scope of what I attended here. So we're just going to end. We're using the landmark Thucydides by Google Books, available through Google Books, which is the Crawley translation. And today we're starting off where we left off. We finished 79, um, 78, 79. So that's and I see how it says sailed back to Samos, right there. It was about the kind of this later stage of the war, the kind of the army abroad, some of the army abroad and their leaders, aided by Alcibiades, convinced the Athenian leaders to start a coup, overthrow the democracy, and maybe as a oligarchy, the Spartans would come to terms with them. If not, coming to terms with them, maybe Alcibiades would be able to bring the Persian king with him, as Alcibiades kind of sold both sides on this, particularly in the Spartans. Originally, he was trying to convince the Spartans of this, but then the Spartan leadership and the field didn't like him, didn't trust him, and that this and plotted against them. And what happened was Alcibiades caught this, and he's, convinced the Spartan, the Persian, and the Persian the emissary from the king of Persia, to kind of like play false with the Spartan allies, not give everything to them as possible, and not let the Spartans win, and play the Spartans and the Athenians off each other as long as possible. And this is what's leading to the Spartans are kind of frustrated. They want to win a battle. Their admiral's been preventing them from directly fighting, and they think the admiral's a coward. Autoculus, was so saying, funny name, and the Athenians are being played cautious. They're not being very aggressive. They're being very cautious. If they're not sure they can win, they're kind of pulling things back. So um, the Athenians are in kind of trouble at this stage after the defeat at Sicily. The Syracusans are allies now of the Spartans and the alliance against Athens. Their ships are with the Spartans in the Aegean area, and they're trying to encourage all the Dorian cities around Asia Minor and the Hellespont to revolt and defeat the things. So now we take it off on chapter 80. which is who said in that sense. In that same summer, immediately after this, the Peloponnesians, having refused to fight with their fleets united, though not thinking themselves the match for the enemy and not knowing where to look for money, for much of the ships, especially as the Papas proved so bad a paymaster, sent off Cerculus, son of Amphius, and 40 ships to Parabanus, according with the original instructions from the Peloponnesians. For Paranabus, he's the Persian, he's the emissary of the king of Persia, who has responsibility for this event, this coordination with the Spartans. Invited them and was prepared to furnish pay in addition to Biancium's. In addition, the Biancium sent um, uh, 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 an offer to revolt to them. These Peloponnesian ships accordingly put to sea put out in the open sea in order to escape the observation of the Athenians. Being overtaken by the storm, the majority of clericos put up into Delos, after which he returned to Mytilus, from which Caracas proceeded by land to the Hellespont to take command of the 10 ships. However, under the Megian Helexius made good their passage to the Hellespont and brought about the revolt of Bansia. After this, the commanders at Samos were informed of it and sent a squadron against them to guard the Hellespont, and and an encounter took place before Bansium between 8 vessels on either side. Meanwhile, this is chapter 81. Meanwhile, the leaders at Samos, especially Thrasbulus, from whom the moment that he had changed the government had remained firmly resolved to recall Alcibiades, at last in the this sounds familiar, I think. I don't know. Okay. Um, at last in the assembly brought over the mass of soldiery, and upon their voting for his recall and amnesty, sailed over to Tissapranus and brought Alcibiades to Samos, being convinced that their only chance of salvation lay in bringing over Tissaphernes from the Peloponnesians to themselves. An assembly was then held in which Alcibiades complained of and deplored his private misfortune in having been banished, and speaking at great length upon public affairs, highly incited their hopes for the future, and extravagantly magnified his own influence with Tissaphernes. His purpose in this was to make the oligarch government at Athens afraid of him, and hasten the dissolution of the clubs, to increase his influence with the army at Samos and heighten their own confidence, and lastly, to prejudice the enemy as strongly as possible against Tissaphernes, blast the hopes which they had entertained. Alcibiades accordingly held out to the army such extravagant promises as follow: that Tissaphernes had solemnly assured him that he could only trust the Athenians should they never want for scruples while he had anything left, nor or no, not even if he should have a coin of his silver couch, even have to coin his own silver couch, and that he would bring the Phoenician fleet now at Pendos to the Athenians instead of the Peloponnesians, but that he could only trust the Athenians if Alcibiades were recalled to be his security for them. Upon hearing this, and beside more, the Athenians at once elected him general, together with the former ones, and put all their affairs into his hand. There was now not a man in the army who had exchanged his present hopes of safety and vengeance upon the 400 for any consideration whatsoever. And after what they had been told, they were now inclined to disdain the enemy before them, and sail once more for the Piraeus. To the plan of sailing for the Piraeus, leaving their more immediate enemies behind, Alcibiades opposed the most positive. Alcibiades opposed the most positive future, in spite of their numbers that insisted upon it, saying that now that he had been elected, he would first sail to Tissaphernes and coordinate with him, measure for carrying on the war. Accordingly, upon leaving this assembly, he immediately took his departure in order to have it thought that that there was a complete trust between them, and also wishing to increase his standing with Tissaphernes, to show that he had now been elected general and was in a position to to do him good or evil as he chose, thus managing to frighten the Athenians with Tissaphernes and Tissaphernes with the Athenians. Meanwhile, the Peloponnesian at Milos heard of the recall of Alcibiades, and being already distrustful of Tissaphernes, now became more disgusted with him than ever. Indeed, after their refusal to go out and give battle to the Athenians, when they appeared before Milos, Tissaphernes had grown slacker than ever in his payment. And even before this, on account of Alcibiades, his unpopularity had been on the increase. Gathering together just as before, the soldiers and some persons of importance beside the soldiers began to reckon up how they had never yet received their pay in full, and what they did receive was small in quantity, and even that had been paid irregularly, and that unless they fought a decisive battle or moved away to some station where they could get supplies, the ship's crews would desert, and that it was all the fault of Aristoclus, who humored Tissaphernes for his own private advantage. The army was engaged in these reflections when the following disturbance took place about the person of Aristolus. The most of the Syracusans and the Reading sailors were free men, and the freest crews in the armament, were alike the boldest in setting on Aristoclus and demanding their pay. The latter answered somewhat stiffly and threatened them when Doria spoke up for his own sailors, even went so far as to lift his baton against him. Upon seeing which, the mass of men, in sailors' fashion, rushed in a fury to strike okay, Aslycus, okay, Asicius, a Spartan admiral. Okay? He, however, saw them in time and fled for refuge to an altar, and they were thus parted without his being struck. Meanwhile, the fort built by Tissaphernes in Mytilus was surprised and taken by the Mytileans, and the garrison in it expelled, an act which met with the approval of the rest of the allies, and in particular of the Syracusans, but which found no favor with Lichus, who said, moreover, that the Melians and the others in the king's realm ought to show a reasonable submission to Tissaphernes, and to pay him court until the war should be happily settled. The Milesians were angry with him for this, and for other things of the kind, and upon his afterwards dying of sickness, would not allow him to be buried where the Spartans and the army desired. Discontent with the army, with Aristoclus and Tissaphernes, had reached a pitch when Minidaris arrived from Sparta to succeed Aristoclus as admiral and assumed command. Aristarchus now set sail for home, and Tissaphernes sent with him one of his confidants, Gorlitz, a Curian, who spoke the two languages, to complain about the Mysileans for the affairs of the fort, and at the same time to defend him against the Mysileans, who were, as he well aware, on their way to Athens, chiefly to denounce his conduct, and had with them Hippocrates, who was to accuse Tissaphernes of joining with Alcibiades to ruin the Peloponnesian cause in playing a double game. Indeed, Hermocrates had always been at enmity with him about the pay not being restored in full, and eventually, when when he was banished from Syracuse, and new commander Parthemus, Miscon, and Democritus had come out to Mytilus to the ships of the Syracusan. Their Phrynes pressed harder than ever upon him in his exile, and among other charges against him, accused him of having once asked him for money, and then pronounced himself an enemy because he failed to obtain it. So there's that, and this is different. This is Phrynes, Phrynes. These are the different leaders. This is the different political leaders in that sense. The Persian political. Now, all this is about the Persian political maneuvers that's going on. Now, this is finishing 3. We're still in chapter 84. This is 4 here, and 4 is continuous. While Aristobulus and the Milesians and Hermocles sailed for Sparta, Alcibiades now crossed back from Tissaphernes to Samos. After his return, the envoys of the 400 who had been sent, as had been mentioned above, to pacify and explain matters to the force of Samos, arrived from Delos, and an assembly was held in which they attempted to speak. The soldiers at first would not hear them and cried out to put to death the subverters of democracy, but at last, after some difficulty, calmed down and gave them a hearing. Upon this, the envoys proceeded to inform them of the recent change had been made to save the city, not to ruin it or to deliver it over to the enemy, for they had already had an opportunity to do this when he invaded the countries during their government, and that all the 500 that all of the 500 would have their proper share in the government, and that the hearers' relatives had neither outrage as Charicles, Charcles. Remember, Charcles made an accusation that they were being, the 500 were, insulting and raping and attacking had slanders reported, nor other ill treatments to complain of, but were all in undisturbed enjoyment of their property just as they had left them. Besides these, they made a number of other statements which had no better success with the angry audience. And amid a host of opinions, the one which found most favor was the one of sailing to the in other words, amid the host of opinions, the one which found the most favor was that of sailing to the Piraeus. Now it was Alcibiades for the first time did state. Now, first time did the now for the first time did the city, the state, in other words, the city a service, and one of the most outstanding kind. For when the Athenians at Samos were bent upon sailing against their country, in which case Ionia and the Hellespont would certainly at once have passed into the possession of the enemy, Alcibiades it was who prevented them. At that moment, when no other man would have been able to hold back the multitude, he put a stop to the intended expedition, and rebuked and turned aside for the resentment felt on personal grounds against the envoys. He dismissed them with an answer from himself to the effect that he did not object to the government of the 500, but insisted that the 400 should be deposed and the council of the 500 reinstated in power. Meanwhile, um, uh, uh, any retrenchments for economy by which pay might be better found for the military met with his complete approval. Generally, he told them to hold out and show a bold force to the enemy, since if the city were to be saved, there was good hope that the two parties might someday be reconciled. Whereas if either were once destroyed at Samos or at Athens, there would no longer be anyone to be reconciled to. Meanwhile, envoys arrived from the Argive with others of support to the Athenian Democrats at Samos. These were thanked by Alcibiades and dismissed with a request to come when called upon. The Argives were accompanied by the crew of the Peleos, who had been placed in a troop ship by the 400, who had come with orders to cruise around Euboea, and with who, when they were being employed to carry to Sparta some Athens envoys sent by the 400, Leoprodos, Aristophon, and Milet, laid hands upon these envoys as they sailed by Argos and delivered them over to the Argives as the chief subverters of the democracy themselves, instead of returning to Athens, took the Argive envoys on board and came to Samos in the trimene, which had been confided to them. So the ship that was the ally of the democracy, who when it went back to Athens was captured. They sent these sailors. They captured the leaders, and then they sent the sailors to the um, on a patrol to Euboea, and then they made them carry envoys that they captured and sailed to the Argives. So you know, talk about complications, right? The same summer, at the time that the return of Alcibiades, coupled with the general conduct of Tissaphernes, had carried to the height the discontent of the Peloponnesians, who no longer entertained any doubt of his having joined the Athenians. Tissaphernes, wishing it would seem to clear himself of these charges, prepared to go to the Phoenician fleet at Aspendos and invite Lycus to go with him, saying that he would appoint Tamos as his lieutenant to provide pay for the fleet during his own absence. Accounts differ, and it's not easy to ascertain with what intention he went to Aspendos and did not bring the fleet after all. The 147 Phoenician ships came as far as Aspindus is certain, but why they did not come further had been variously accounted for. Further did not come further has been vigorously accounted for. Some think that he went away in pursuance of his plan for wasting the Peloponnesian resources, since at any rate Tamos, as lieutenant, far from being any better, provided a worse paymaster than himself. And others believe that he brought the Peloponnesian to Aspendos to extract money from them for their discharge. Having neither intended to employ them, others again think that it was in view of the outcry against him at Sparta, in order that it might be said that he was not at fault, but that the ships were already manned, and that he had certainly gone to fetch them. To myself, it seems only too evident that he did not bring up the fleet because he wished to wear out and paralyze the Hellenic forces, that is, to waste their strength by time lost during his journey to Aspendus, and to keep them evenly balanced, not by throwing his weight into either side. Had he wished to finish the war, he could have done so, assuming, of course, he had made his appearance in a way which left no room for doubt, as by bringing up the fleet, he would, in all probability, had given the victory to the Spartans, whose navy, even as it was, faced the Athenians more as an equal than an inferior. But what convicts him the most clearly is the excuse which he put forward of not bringing the ships. He said that the numbers assembled was less than the king's order, but surely it would have only had enhanced his credit if he spent a little of the king's money and accompanied the same and accomplished the same end at less cost. In any case, whatever his intention, Tissaphernes went to Aspendus and saw the Phoenicians, uh, and the Peloponnesians, at his request, sent a Spartan called Philip with two trimenes to bring the fleet. When Alcibiades discovered that Tissaphernes had gone to Aspendus, he sailed there himself with 13 ships, promising to do a great and certain service for the Athenians at Samos, as he would have either bring the Phoenician fleet to the Athenians, or in any event prevent them from joining the Peloponnesians. It was all probability he had long known that Tissaphernes never meant to bring the fleet at all, and wished to compromise him as much as possible in the eyes of the Peloponnesians through his apparent friendship with himself and the Athenians, and thus in a manner to oblige him to join their side. Alcibiades weighed anchor and sailed eastward straight for Perseus and Kaunos, uh, 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 Kaunos, and the envoys sent by the 400 to Samos arrived at Athens. Upon their delivering the message from Alcibiades, telling them to hold out and show a firm front to the enemy, and saying that he had great hopes of reconciling them with the army and of overcoming the Peloponnesians. The majority of the members of the oligarchies who were already discontented and only not too much inclined to be quiet of the, no, sorry, not quiet, inclined to be quit of the business in any safe way that they could, were at once strengthened in their resolve. These now branded together and strongly criticized the administration, their leader being some of the principal generals and men in office under the oligarchy, such as Tissaphernes, son of Hagon, Haganon, and Aristocrates, son of Sicylanus, and others who, though among the most prominent members of the government, were afraid, as they said, of the army at Samos, and especially of Alcibiades, and also feared that the envoys whom they had just sent to Sparta might do the state some harm, the city some harm, without the authority of the majority. And so, without insisting on their objections to the excessive concentration of power in the hands of few, they nevertheless urged that the 5,000 must be shown to exist not merely in name but in reality, and the Constitution placed upon a fairer basis. But this was merely a political cry. Most of them were driven by private ambition into a line of conduct socially fatal to oligarchies that rise out of democracy. For all that, for all at once, for all at once pretend to be not only equals, but each the chief and master of his fellows, while in a democracy, a disappointed candidate accepts his defeat more easily because he has not the humiliation of being beaten by his equals. But what most clearly encourages the Malcon, the malcontents um, was the power of Alcibiades at Samos, and their own conviction that the oligarchy was unstable, and that it was now a race among them as to whom should become the leader of the people. Now, chapter 90. Meanwhile, the leaders and members of the 400 now who most opposed a democratic form of government, of Frasilinus, okay, okay, this is Phralic, Phranikius, who had held a quarrel with Alcibiades during his command at Samos. Aristoculus, the bitter and inveterate enemy of the democracy, and Pisander and Antiphon, and the others who were very powerful, and who were ready as soon as they entered upon power. And again, when the army at Samos seceded from them, had declared for democracy, had sent envoys from their own body to Sparta, and made every effort for peace. Were building the wall in Etonia. Now redoubled their efforts when the envoys returned from Samos, and they saw not only the people but their own most trusted associates turning against them. Alarmed at the state of things at Athens and at Samos, they now sent off in haste Aristophon and Perinikus and the other 10 with injunctions to make peace with Sparta on any terms, no matter what, and that would be at all tolerable. Meanwhile, they pushed on more actively than ever with the wall in Etonia. Now, the meaning of this wall, according to this Theramenes and his supporters, was not so much to keep out the army of Samos and the army of Samos in case of it trying to force its way into the Piraeus, as to be able to let in. I'm so sorry. The Piraeus, as to be able to let in at pleasure the fleet and the army of the enemy. For Etonia is a breakwater of the Piraeus, closely alongside the entrance of the harbor, and was now being fortified in connection with the wall already existing on the land side, so that a few men placed in it might be able to command the entrance. The old wall on the land side and the new one being built within on the side of the sea, both ending in one of the two towers standing in the narrow mouth of the harbor. They also walled off the largest porch in the Piraeus, which was connected to this wall, and kept it in their own hands, compelling all to unload the grain that had come into the harbor, and that what they had in stock, and to take it out from where they had sold it. These measures had long provoked the murmurs of Theramenes, and when the envoys returned from Sparta without having effected any general peace agreement, he affirmed that this was likely to prove the ruin of the city, the ruin of the state, ruin of the city. At this moment, 42 ships from the Peloponnesian, including Sicilian and Italian vessels from Lycia and Thyrium, had been invited over by the Euboeans and were already anchored off Las in Laconia, preparing for their voyage to Euboea under the command of Aeges and Redas, Aeges and Rides, the son of Agesander, a Spartite. Theramenes now asserted that this squadron was destined not so much to aid Euboea as for the the party fortifying Eutonia, and that unless precautions were speedily taken by the city, the city would be surprised and lost. This was no calamity. a calumny. Sorry, this was no mere calumny. There being really some such plan entertained by the accused, for their first wish was to have the oligarchy without giving up the empire. Failing this, to keep their ships and the walls and be independent. While if this also were denied them, sooner than be the first victims of the restored democracy, they resolved to call in the enemy and make peace, giving up their walls and ships at all costs, and retain their possession of the government, if only their lives were assured to them. Okay. In other words, they were they had this is the things of this. In fact, this is the kind of example what was happening. This is the main city. This is the long wall, the Piraeus, and this is the new wall that was being built here, like to kind of block off the. Um, no, it's right here. You can see that's still the wall. For this reason, they hastened the construction of their work with the postern gates and entrances and means of introducing the enemy and being eager to have it finished on time. Meanwhile, the murmurs against them were at first confined to very few persons and went on secret until Pherenicus, in his return from the embassy of Sparta, had was laid wait for and stabbed in the open market, one by one of the Peripetui, one of the ships of the people. The Peripetui were the people of the ship, right, from Samos that came there, right, and fell down dead before he had gone far from the council chambers. The assassin escaped, but his accomplice, an Argive, was taken and put to torture by the 400 without their being able to extract from him the name of his employer or anything further than what that he knew of many men who used to assemble at the house of the commander of the Peripoli and other houses. Here, the matter was allowed to drop. For this so embodied Theramenes and aristocracies, and the rest of their partisans in the 400 and outside that body, that they now resolved to act. For by this time the ships had sailed around from Laes, anchoring at um, Epidaeus, and had overrun Aegina, and Thisamenes asserted that, being bound for Abia, they would never have sailed into the Aegean and come back to anchor at Ephidaurus unless they had been invited to come to the aid in the design of which he had always accused the government. Therefore, inaction had further inaction had therefore now become impossible. In the end, after a great many seditious harangues and suspicion, they all set to work in real earnest. The hoplites in the Piraeus, who were building the wall in Emonia, among whom was Aristocrates, a commander having soldiers of his own tribe, laid his hands on Achilles, a general under the laid hands upon Achilles, the general under the oligarchy and devoted adherent to the cabal, and took him into a house and confined him there. In this they were assisted by one Hemeron, commander of the Peripoli in Munchilia, and others. Above all, they had the support of the great bulk of the hoplites. As soon as the news of this reached the 400, who happened to be sitting in council chambers, all except the disaffected wished at once to go to the posts where the arms were, and threatened Theramenes and his party. Theramenes defended himself and said that he was already immediate was he that he was ready immediately to go to help to rescue Alex, Alexis and take with him one of the generals belonging to his party, went down to the prayers, followed by Aristarchus and some young men of the cavalry. All was now panic and confusion. Those in the city imagined that the Piraeus had already been taken and prisoners put to death. And those in the Piraeus expected at any moment to be attacked by the party in the city. The older men, however, stopped the person running up and down the city and making for the stands for the stands of arms. And Thucydides, the Pharisee, proxenus of the city, came forward and threw himself between the rival factions and appealed to them not to ruin the city, ruin the state, while the enemy was still nearby awaiting for his opportunity. And so at length succeeded in quieting them, in keeping them from attacking each other. Meanwhile, Theramenes came down to the Piraeus, being himself one of the generals, and raged and stormed against the hoplites, while Aristarchus and the opponents of the people were generally infuriated. Most of the hoplites, however, went on with the business without faltering, and asked Theramenes if he thought the wall had been constructed for any good purpose, and whether it would not be better that it should be pulled down. To this he answered that if they thought it would be best to pull it down, he was, for his part, agreed with them. Upon this, the hoplites and the number of the people in the Piraeus immediately on got up on the fortifications and began to demolish it. Now their cry to the multitude was that all should join in the work who wished the 5,000 to govern instead of the 400. And instead of saying in so many words, all who wish the people to govern, they still distinguished themselves under the name of the 5,000, being afraid that these might really exist and that might be speaking to one of their numbers and get into trouble through ignorance. Indeed, this is why the 400 neither wish the 500 to exist nor to have it known that they did not exist, being of the opinion that to give themselves to so many partners in empire would be downright democracy, while the mystery in question would make the people afraid of one another. The next day, the 400, although alarmed, nevertheless assembled the council chambers, while the hoplites were in the Piraeus, and having released their prisoner Alexius and pulled down the fortification, went with the arms to the theater of Dionysus, close to Mucia. They held an assembly in which they decided to march into the city and setting forth accordingly, halted in the Anaseum. Here they joined by some delegates from the 400, who reasoned with them one by one and persuaded those they saw to be more moderate to remain quiet themselves and to restrain the rest, saying that they would make known the 5,000 and have the 400 chosen from them in rotation, as it should be decided by the 5,000, and meanwhile entreated them not to ruin the city or divide it into arms of the enemy, drive it into the arms of the enemy. After a great many had spoken and had been spoken of, the whole body of hoplites became calmer than before, absorbed by their fears for their country at large, and now agreed to hold upon the appointed day an assembly in the theater of Dionysus for the restoration of Concord. When the day came for the assembly in the theater, there were upon the points of assembling news arrived that 42 ships under Aegiandrias were sailing from Megria along the coast of Salamis. The people, to by a man, now thought that it was just what Theramenes and his party had so often said, that the ships were sailing to the fortification, and concluded that they had done well to demolish it. But though it was possible to have been appointed by that uh, 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 but though it may possibly have been appointed that Ageradius hovered about Euphrates in the neighborhood, he would also naturally be kept there by the hope of an opportunity arising out of the troubles in the city. In any case, the Athenians, upon receipt of this news, immediately ran down en masse to the Piraeus, seeing themselves threatened by an enemy with a worse war than their war among themselves, not at a distance, but close to the harbor of Athens. Some went on board the ships already afloat, and others launched fresh vessels to ram and defend the walls at the mouth of the harbor. Meanwhile, the Peloponnesian vessels sailed on, rounding Sanium, anchored between Thorcus and Persia, and after arrived at Oropus. The Athenians, with revolution in the city and unwilling to lose a moment in going to the relief of their most important possession, for Euboea was everything to them now that they were shut out of Attica, were compelled to put to sea in haste with untrained crews, and sent Thermocles with some vessels to Etruria. Upon their arrival, the ships already in Euboea made up a total of 36 vessels, and immediately forced to engage. For Agerius, after his crews were taking their dinner, put out to Otrupus, and is about 7 miles from Etruria by sea. And the Athenians, seeing him sailing up, immediately began to man their vessels. The sailors, however, instead of being in their ships, as they were supposed, were going away to purchase provisions for the dinner in the house in the outskirts of the city. And the Etrurians, having arranged that there should be nothing on sale in the agora, in order that the Athenians might be a long time in manning their ships, that and the enemy attacking them might taking them by surprise, might compel them to put to sea as they were. A signal was also raised in Etruria to give them notice in Orupus when to put to sea. The Athenians, forced to put out so poorly prepared, engaged off the harbor in Tria, and after holding their own for some little while notwithstanding, were at length put to fight and chased to the shore. Such of their number as taken refuge in Etruria, which they presumed to be friendly to them, found their fate in the city, being butchered by the inhabitants, while those who fled to the Athenian fort in the Etranian territory, and the vessels which got to Chikias were saved. The Peloponnesians, after taking 22 Athenian ships and killing or making prisoner of the crews, set up a trophy. Not long afterwards, effected the revolt of the whole Euboea, except Ormus, which was held by the Athenians themselves, and made a general settlement of the affair of the island. When the news of what happened in Euboea reached the Athenians, a panic ensued, such as they had never known before. Neither disaster in Sicily, great as it seemed at the time, nor any other, had ever so much alarmed them. The fleet at Samos was in revolt. They had no more ships or men to man them than they were in conflict among themselves, and might at any moment come to blows. And a disaster of this magnitude, coming on top of everything else, by which they lost their fleet, and worst of all, Euboea, which was more valuable to them than Attica, could not occur without throwing them into the deepest despondency. Meanwhile, their greatest and most immediate trouble was the possibility that the enemy, emboldened by this victory, might make straight for them and sail against the Piraeus, which they no longer had ships to defend. At the very moment they expected the enemy to arrive, and every moment they expected the enemy to arrive, this was little. This, with a little more courage, he might have done, in which case he would have increased the dimensions of the city by his presence, or if he had swayed to besiege it, have compelled the fleet from Ionia. Although opposed to the oligarchy, to come to the rescue of their country and to their relatives, and in the meantime, the enemy would have become master of the Hellespont, Ionia, and the islands, and everything else as far as Euboea. So, to speak roundly of the whole Athenian empire. But here, as on many other occasions, the Spartans proved the most convenient people in the world for the Athenians to be at war. The wide difference between between the two characters, the slowness and want of energy of the Spartans, as contrasted to the dash and enterprise of their opponents, proved the greatest service, especially to the maritime empire like Athens. Indeed, this was shown by the Syracusans, who were most like the Athenians in character, and also the most successful in combating them. Nevertheless, upon receipt of news of the Athenians manned 20 ships, immediately called for the assembly in the Pranex, which they had been accustomed to meet formerly, and deposed the 400, and voted to hand over the government to the 5,000, of which body all who furnished a suit of armor would be a member, decreeing also that no one should receive pay for discharge of any office, or that he did, or if he did, should be held accused. Many accursed. Many other assemblies were held afterwards, in which lawmakers were elected, and all the other measures taken to form a constitution, a politeia, right, regime. It was during it was during the first period of this constitution that the Athenians appeared to have joined the best government that they ever did, at the least in my time. For the fusion of the high and the low was accomplished with judgment, and this was the first, and what first enabled the city to raise up her head after her manifold disasters. They also voted to recall Alcibiades and the other exiles, and sent him into to the camp of Samos, and urged them to devote themselves vigorously to the war. Upon this revolution taking place, the party of Pisander and Ecleus and the chiefs of the oligarchies immediately withdrew to Declia, with the exception of Aristarchus, one of the generals, hastily took some of the most barbarians of who hastily took some of the most barbarians of the archers and marched to Oni. This was the fort of the Athenians upon the Bottian border, at the most besieged by the Corinthians, who were responding to the loss of a party returned from Dokia, who had been cut off by the garrison. The Corinthians had volunteered for this service and had been called upon the Bottians to assist them. After communicating with them, Aristarchus deceived the garrison at Oni, telling them that their countrymen in the city had settled with the Spartans, and that one of the terms of capitulation was that they must surrender the place to the Bottians. The garrison believed him, that as he was a general, and besides knowing nothing of what had occurred owing to the siege, had so evacuated the force under truce, and in this way the Bottians gained possession of Oni, and the oligarchy and the troubles at Athens ended. To return to the Peloponnesians at so that we end the stories of what's happening in the oligarchy, end of the oligarchy, and how then the general, one of the members of the took some soldiers and went to the besieged the thought fort and said, "Oh no, no!" This lied to them and handed over the fortress to the Boeotians. To return to the Peloponnesians in Mytilenus. No pay was forthcoming from any of their agents appointed by Tissaphernes for that purpose upon his departure for Apendas. Neither the Phoenician fleet nor Tissaphernes showed any sign of appearing. And Philip, who had been sent with him, and another Spartite, Hippocrates, who was at Phaelis, sent word to Mendanus, the admiral, that the ship was not coming at all, and that they or being grossly abused by Tissaphernes. Meanwhile, Thebasius was inviting them to come and making every effort to get the fleet and, like Tissaphernes, to cause the revolt of the cities in his province that were still subject to Athens, founding great hopes on his success at any length. At about the same time in the summer, Mitidarchus, yielding to his request, and with great order and a moment's notice, in order to elude the enemy at Samos, weighed anchor with 73 ships from Mytilus, and he set sail for the Hellespont. 16 vessels had already preceded him there in the same summer, and had overrun a part of the Charoneses. Being caught in a storm, Midrasis was compelled to run in Icarus, and after being detained 5 or 6 days by stress of the weather, arrived at Chios. Meanwhile, Thrasyllus had heard of his having put out from Miletus, and immediately set sail with 55 ships from Samos, hurrying to arrive before him at the Hellespont. But learning that he was at Chiros, and expecting that he would stay there, he posted scouts in Lesbos and on the continent opposite, to prevent the fleet moving without his knowing it, and himself sailed along the coast to Bithynia, and gave orders to prepare ground, barley, and other necessities in order to attack them from Lesbos, in the event of their remaining for any length of time at Cheros. Meanwhile, he resolved to sail against Erasus, a city in Lesbos, which had revolted, and to take it if he could. For some of the principal Mysian exiles had carried over about 50 hoplites and their sworn associates from Kimi, and hiring others from the mainland to do mainland, so as to make up 300 in all. Chose Alexander, a Theban, to command them, on account of the community of blood existing between the Thebans and the Lesbians, and first attacks Mythia. Thwarted in this attempt by the advance of the Athenian guard from Mytilene, and repulsed a second time in a battle outside the city, they crossed the mountain and brought about the revolt of Irius. Thrasius accordingly determined to go there with all his ships and attack the place. Meanwhile, Tharabulus had preceded him there with 5 ships from Samos, and as soon as he heard that the exiles had crossed over, and coming too late to save Erissus, went out and anchored before the city. Here they were joined by 2 vessels on their way home from the Hellespont, and that the ships of the Mettians were making a grand total of 77 vessels, and the force on board already made the siege engines and every other means available to do their utmost to storm um, Aristos. Aristos. That's Aristos right here. In the meantime, Menandus and the Peloponnesian fleet at Chios, after taking provisions for 2 days and received 3 Chanians' piece of money for each man from the Chanians, on the third day sailed out in haste from the island in order to avoid falling in with the ships at Erasmus. They did not make for the open sea, but kept Lesbos on their left, sailed for the mainland. After touching at the port of Keteria, so this is Kid's kid. The territory of Phocaria, and having their dinner, they went along the Camarian, um, the Camarian coast, and took supper at Arganeose on the mainland over near Mytilene. So around here, this is where Aristogarian is. Oh, look at that. From there, they continued their voyage along the seacoast, although it was late at night, arriving at Harandotus here. So this map. Okay. On the continent opposite Metima, took a meal there, and swiftly passing Lectium, Lacia, Haximachus, and the nearby cities, arrived a little before midnight at Ritorum. So Ritorum is here. There they were now in the Hellespont. Some of the ships also put at Sigmund earlier, and other places in the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the warning of the fire signals and the sudden increase in the number of fires on the enemy's shore informed the 18 Athenian ships from Sittos of the approach of the Peloponnesian fleet. That every night they set sail in haste, just as they were, and hugging the shore at Cheronazi, coasted along to Ilos in order to sail out into the open sea away from the fleet of the enemy. After passing unobserved by 16 ships at Abydos, and although they had been warned of their approaching friends to be on alert to preventing their sailing out, at dawn they sighted the fleet of Midarus, and immediately gave chase. All had not time to get away. The great number, however, escaped to Imbros and Lemnos, while 4 of those in the rear were overtaken by Elias. One of these was stranded opposite of the temple of Protelius and taken by its crew. 2 others without their crews, the 4th abandoned on shore of Ambrose and burned by the enemy. As after this, the Peloponnesians were joined by the squadron from Abydos, which brought their fleet to the grand total of 86 vessels, which spent the day in unsuccessfully besieging Alybius and then sailed back to Abydos. Meanwhile, the Athenians, deceived by their scouts, and never dreamed that the enemy's fleet would go by undetected, were tranquilly besieging Eros. As soon as they heard the news, they instantly abandoned Eros and made with all speed for the Hellespont. And after taking 2 of the Peloponnesian ships, which had been carried out too far to the open sea in the ardor of pursuit, and now had fallen in their way, dropped anchor the next day in Aeolus, where they brought back the ships they had taken refuge in Imbros, and for 5 days prepared the coming engagement. So there's this battle. This battle is going to be here. After this, they engaged the following way. The Athenians formed a column and sailed close along the shore of Stetos, upon perceiving which the Peloponnesians put out from Abydos to meet them. Realizing this battle was now imminent, both combatants combined their flank. The Athenians along the Chersonese from Ichthus to Arenia, while 76 ships with 76 ships, and the Peloponnesians from Abydos to Darien with 86. The Peloponnesian right wing was occupied by the Syracusans. They were left by the Mendaeus in person with the best sailors in the navy, and the Athenians left by Tharicius, the right by Bulus, and the other commanders being in different parts of the fleet. The Peloponnesians hastened to engage first, and outflanking their left, the Athenian right sought to cut them off, if possible, from sailing out of the straits, and to drive their center into the shore. This was not far off, and the Athenians, perceiving their intentions, extended their own right wing to and outsailed them, while their left had by this time passed the point of Chromesia, and this, however, obliged them to thin and weaken the center, especially as they had fewer ships than the enemy, and around the coast round Point Chronosmia formed a sharp angle which prevented them their seeing what was happening to the other side of it. The Peloponnesians attacked their center and drove ashore the ships of the Athenians, and disembarked to follow upon their victory. No help could be given to the center either by the squadron of Thraspulus on the right, or on account of the number of ships attacking him, or that of Thrasyllus on the left, from the point from whom the point of Cresomia had hid what was going on, and who was also hindered by his Syracusan and other opponents, whose numbers were fully equal to his own. At length, however, the Peloponnesians, in their confidence of victory, began to scatter in pursuit of ships of the enemy, and allowed a considerable part of their fleet to get into disorder. On seeing this, the squadron of Tharabusulus discontinued their lateral formation, and phasing about, attacked and routed the ships opposed them, and the next fell fiercely upon the scattered vessels of the victorious Peloponnesian division, and put most of them to flight without a blow. The Syracusans had by this time given way before the squadron of Theraculus, and now openly took to flight upon seeing the flight of their comrades. The rout was now complete. Most of the Peloponnesians fled for refuge, first to the river Medeus and afterwards to Abydos. Only a few ships were taken by the Athenians, as owing to the narrowness of the Hellespont, the enemy had not far to go to be in safety. Nevertheless, nothing could have been more opposite to them than this. Nevertheless, nothing could have been more opportune for them than this victory. Up to this time, they had feared the Peloponnesian fleet, owing to a number of pretty losses and disaster in Sicily. But now they cease to mistrust themselves, and no longer think their enemy is good for anything at sea. Meanwhile, they took from the enemy 8 Chian vessels, 5 Corinthians, 2 Ambrosius, to 1 Ludian, Spartans, Syracusan, and Pelion, losing 15 of their own. After settling upon a trophy at Point Chrononisa, securing the wrecks and restoring to the enemy his dead under truce, they set off at Trimene to Athens with the good news of the victory. The arrival of this vessel, with its unhoped good news, sent after the recent disaster to Libya, and during the revolution of Athens, gave fresh courage to the Athenians, and caused them to believe that if they had put their soldier to the wheel, their cause might yet prevail. On the fourth day after the fight, a sea fight, the Athenians and Thessalus, having hastily refitted their ships, sailed against Acrasius, which had revolted. Off Herbegacium Piraeus, they sighted anchor 8 vessels from Byzantium, and sailing up and routing the troops on shore, took the ships, and then went on and recovered the city of Asios, which was unfortified and levied money from the citizens. In the meantime, the Peloponnesians sailed from Abos to Ilus and recovered such of the captured themes as were still uninjured, and the rest having been burnt by the Eleuthians, and sent Hippocramus and Epicurus to Euboea to bring the squadron from that island. About the same time, Alcibiades returned with 13 ships from Calnus and Phaeus to Samos, bringing word that he had prevented the Phoenician fleet from joining the Peloponnesians and made Tissaphernes more friendly to the Athenians than before. Alcibiades now manned 9 more ships and levied a large sum of money from the Hessarians and fortified coasts. After doing this, placed a governor on coast. After doing this and placing a governor on coast, he sailed back to Samos, autumn now being at hand. Meanwhile, Tissaphernes, upon hearing that the Peloponnesian fleet had sailed from Mytilus to the Hellespont, set off again from Aspendus, and having all sail for Ionia. While the Peloponnesians were in the Hellespont, the Andreas, the Antarians, a people of Arioch extraction, conveyed by land across Mount Ada some hoplites from Aedeos and introduced them to the city, having been ill-treated by Archias, the Persian lieutenant of Tissaphernes. This same Archias had, upon pretense of a secret quarrel, invited the chief men of the Delians to undertake military service, and these Delians, who had settled at Antaretium, having had been driven out from their homes by the Athenians for the sake of purifying Delos, and after drawing them out from their city, his friends and allies had laid wait for them at dinner, surrounded them, and caused them to be shot down by his soldiers. This deed made the Antarians fear that he might some day do to them some mischief, and that he also had laid upon them the burden too heavy for them to bear. They expelled his garrison from their citadel. And this is the last chapter, 409. Tissaphernes, upon hearing this act of the Peloponnesians, and in addition to what had occurred at Mytilus and Sidlus, where his garrisons had been expelled, now saw that the breach between them was serious, and fearing further injury from them, and being also vexed to think that Penabrazos should receive them, and in less time and in less cost, perhaps succeed better against the Athenians than he had done, determined to rejoin them in the Hellespont in order to complain of the event at Antidaris and excuse himself as best he could in the matter of the Phoenician fleet and the other charges against him. Accordingly, he went first to Ephesus and offered sacrifice to Artemis. And the winter of this when winter of this summer is over, the 21st year of this war would be complete. Right? This is where he ends. He ends not finishing the winter of this. Well, I think I want to. I think I want to end here, but I might want to just also read this part a little bit. This is from the epilogue. I'll go here to it. Maybe so we end the war and the thing. The epilogue. He goes. This is like straightforward. He goes. This is the Crawley's epilogue. Crawley, the translator. Thucydides, and this is like a couple pages. Thucydides' narrative breaks off in the middle year 411. Although he returned from Athens from exile after the war ended in 404, the last years of the war chiefly did leave their mark on his final revisions of the text, and you see this at book 2, chapter 65, book 2, chapter 100, book 4, chapter 81, and book 6, chapter 16. Right? Unfortunately, we lack what might have been his accounts of both of Athene's partial military recovery, marked by her two great naval victories at Chryseis and Argones, and her final defeat at Aragopani, where, assisted by obtuse and perhaps inexperienced Athenian commanders, the Spartan admiral Lysander enjoyed stealth and superior tactics to capture on the beach almost the entire Athenian fleet in the Hellespont. After that disaster, the Athenians had no means left which to prevent Lysander from blockading their city, starving her of the grain from the Black Sea region, on which she largely depended, and ultimately forcing her to sue for peace. Victorious, Sparta, after initially contemplating total destruction of her defeated adversary, finally decided that Athens should be allowed to continue to exist as a city, but demanded the surrender of what remained of her fleet and the demolitions of the walls of Piraeus and the Long Wall, and guaranteeing complete freedom to the former subject cities of what had been the Athenian Empire. Now supreme in Greece, Sparta thus reduced Athens to the state of isolation, weakness, and despondency, which must have been dreadful indeed to the writer of Pericles' Philonian orations. In his obituary of Pericles at chapter 2, Thucydides wrote the end of the war, which he acknowledged the vital role of the Persian prince Cyrus the Younger in maintaining Sparta. Yet he has little to say of the body of the text about the rising importance of Persia and Greek affairs. In truth, although the Persian governor at Sardis, Tissaphernes, never did honor his promise to provide the fleet to assist the Spartans, his meager financial support, along with that of Phrynibacius at the Hellespont, did permit Sparta to challenge Athens in the Aegean and to bring about the revolt of many Asian Greek cities from Athenian alliance. It was Syracuse the Younger, however, the successor of Tissaphernes, who demanded of his father Darius II a real naval support be provided to Sparta, and whose assistance and collusions with Lysander encouraged the Spartans to persevere despite setback. Thus, even though through the Aregispi was won without the help of the Persian fleet, Sparta found herself greatly indebted to Cyrus at the end of the war. And when Darius died in 404, and Cyrus began to assemble an army to support his claim to the throne, the Spartans had no choice to become involved, partly by her obligation of gratitude and partly by the reflection that if Cyrus were to succeed without her aid, she would feel his wrath. So Sparta made a contribution to Cyrus' expedition and provided the creation of the mercenary force of Greek hoplites for his army. This is, Xenophon's famous Anabasis. So therefore, we get I'm not going to read much of it. I just wanted to read that portion that explains the end of the war, what was not covered about this. And I think this is what is useful in this sense. Well, I think that was been wonderful to do this with you guys, all of you. I'm going to start the next short thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be doing a series on Locke's second treatise. That'll be kind of quick, and then I'll turn to either I think I will do a double project of the politics and the spirit of the laws, in the sense that on different days. Well, that's it, and I hope you're all okay, and thank you for joining me during this thing. If you like what you're doing, please put comments in the bottom. You can please put the comments there. Share with a friend. If you don't like it, you can say no. Criticism in the bottom, please. When I see them, I'll respond. to them. And and if you have any questions, I will again answer them as best I can when I see them. Um, if you want to follow me on social media, the information is below. If you want to help me continue these things, these projects, please, you can feel free to Patreon or subscribe. I understand I'm not that good in these things, so in the sense that this is I'm learning, continuing learning and developing these things. This is not that super duper in that sense, I say. So again, thank you for being with us as we read through Thucydides, and have a great day. Take care. Bye bye.